Good evening. Good evening. So, Geoff, I guess we should begin by, or I'll begin by asking you why or how have you wound up back on these shores? Because I read at multiple places, I think, that you'd always wanted to live in, was it LA specifically, or just the American West?
Yeah, thank you, Lias. Yeah, that is a good place to start. Yeah, so so we've moved back to London. We've been back here just over a couple of weeks now, and during the early 2000s, I guess, I'd always wanted to live in California, like so many people have historically. You know, even people in America want to go further west to the promised land of California, and that's what it's always been. I mean, mythically, famously. And
Like Grapes of Wrath or something.
I mean, just, yeah, or even before that, you know, the gold rush and, you know, anyway, so for many years, I really felt it was my destiny to live in California. And because I hadn't, I said all the time to Rebecca, my wife, my whole life is a failure because I'm not living in California. And then out of the blue, Rebecca got an offer to work in California. So there we were, off to California. But I'd always wanted to live in San Francisco, not Los Angeles, where Rebecca had got work, where I'd never had a good time. So in a kind of rather representative way, there I was in California, but not in the part of it. You know, I was sort of dream adjacent. And then anyway, I mean, Los Angeles has certain things going for it. And then I also always believed, though, that one of these cushy American universities would offer me a well-paid, cushy job. And
I thought they did, no?
They did, yeah. And it's crucial. And the crucial thing is that I didn't have to apply for it because I'm one of these people, there might be others in the room, that if I ever apply for anything at all, from a passport to anything, I always mess up the application. So this job really fell into my lap, and it was for 5 years. Those flashed by, so I renewed it rather like Mo Salah. I renewed it for another 5, and then that all flashed by. So we'd ended up being in Los Angeles for 10 years, and that was enough because it really was, because something else perverse had happened. Having always dreamed of being in California, it became not the place of dreams, but the place where I happened to live. And the corollary of that was the place I'd come from acquired this kind of nostalgic, retrospective glow of some Blakean, you know, vision of Albion. And we decided to come back. There are all sorts of other reasons as well.
Is that where this book comes from, to a certain extent?
Well, I think writing the book actually contributed to that somewhat perhaps deluded sense of this Blakean paradise. The other thing is we always used to come back to London in the summers, and it was so great being here. I was seeing it through the eyes of American tourists who always, you know, we'd get around, and of course it's easy to get around London, unlike in LA, and I thought, God, I wouldn't be surprised to find myself on one of those open deck, hop on or hop off tourist buses. We liked it.
So you had to kind of enfeeble yourself to the status of an American tourist in order to be able to appreciate
well, we just sort of
this country.
Yeah, we just kind of liked everything about
yeah, like
it.
easily amazed.
Yeah,
Everything
I mean, it was, and then, okay, so we decided to come back, and then, of course, the change of regime didn't do America any favor.
History in motion, though, you know, it's front row seats.
I mean, really, and yeah, so it was exciting being there for that. I mean, so it feels great to be back in, and I will never ever complain about the London Tube again, having been in a city where there is no real, where there isn't a great public transport system. So it's great to be back.
Okay. Have you ever lived anywhere other than Cheltenham for more than 10 years?
Yeah, I lived in London in total for way more than 10 years.
Okay.
And yeah, it's yeah, so I feel completely, even when because I've ended up with an American passport, and even when I was, swearing my allegiance, saying, it's to America and no one else, really, I always knew my real allegiance was to...
You actually had to swear allegiance.
Yeah, you sort of do, to the flag, but I knew my allegiance was always to England. I was a sort of double agent, really.
Okay, well, it's good to have you back, I think. I suspect, we'll see how it pans out. It's only been a couple of weeks. Give it 10 years, I guess. But I guess moving on from that, like why, other than a complete disenchantment with America, why now for a kind of straight down the middle childhood memoir with none of the kind of postmodern kind of trickery, if you like, of the more kind of...
Okay, so... Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is it's an age-appropriate form for me to be grappling with. You'll remember that I think it was in 1973, B.S. Johnson published a book with a great title, Aren't You Rather Young to Be Writing Your Memoirs? And, I'll be 67 next week, so this is obviously... So I was in my 60s when I started seriously thinking about this. Both of my parents had died, so it's a way of not bringing them back to life, but of sort of reflecting on them. They died in 2011. So yeah, just the sort of straightforward actuarial kind of forces at work, I think, meant it was a good time to look back. It wasn't always... I mean, you're absolutely right, Lias. It's a completely conventional memoir formally. It starts with me being born.
Yeah, chronological. It doesn't go on in endless tangents.
No, it really doesn't.
Follow the river down to the...
But what I want to say in my defense is that wasn't my intention, because initially I was going to do a much more complicated form of memoir. And this does require a little bit of a tangent in that I did this... many years ago, I contributed to an anthology called Where Are We?, where they asked writers to design a map. So, on an ordnance survey map, there's a symbol for pubs or post offices or churches. So I drew a map of my hometown, and instead of places like that, it had symbols, like there was a symbol of a fist to show where I got punched in the face, or there was lips to show where I sort of had a romantic encounter, and all these kind of things. So it was a map of my life, and that's what I was going to do. And I thought, where's that map? I just had a couple of lines like, this is where I got, this is where I got, this is where I had sex in a car park, all that kind of stuff. Whereas this was going to feature extended descriptions of those sexual encounters in car parks. I was really looking forward to writing it.
There's some of that in there.
Just
There's a few, precious nuggets.
Right. But so that was my intention. More seriously, it was going to be, instead of a memoir which unfolds in a temporal scheme, it was going to be a sort of unfolds spatially, geographically. And it was okay, I was writing these episodes, but then I'd always come up against the formal problems, and the map idea was just always causing trouble, And eventually I realized it had become not just a trouble, a sort of bump in the road, it had become an absolute insurmountable wall. And then as soon as I realized that I could actually get round this wall by doing it chronologically, everything fell really easily into place. So I arrived at a very conventional book by trial and error. I didn't just think, okay, this is how you write a memoir. You start at 0 and go till you're 18.
Okay.
So that's it was a very elaborate way to arrive at a rather simple solution, let's say.
Because I thought, following a book about endings and then a book about beginnings, I thought maybe you were sort of settling your existential tab, perhaps, and maybe you were unwell or something.
I mentioned this in the sort of little note at the end, this kind of weird way that the writing life, one is so not aware of things. So this journalist said, okay, you've written a book about endings. Would you like to write about a book about beginnings? And I said, no, I've got no interest in that. Edward Said's written a book about beginnings. And then in another interview just a little bit later, I was, oh my God, I've actually just finished writing a book about beginnings, my own beginnings. It just hadn't occurred to me that's what it was about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like, I think for somebody that's played so many kind of stylistic kind of games almost throughout your kind of career, it was kind of like unexpected, I guess. And do you find like that sometimes being a kind of, that's kind of the thing I love most about your work, I think, is the kind of style, the voice, essentially. But do you find having a kind of like a kind of Houdini-like deftness, like with style, can actually be kind of a little bit of a prison sometimes?
It can be. I think it became. It can be. I feel that. I think stylistically there's still a lot going on here. I think the other thing that I've always had sort of going for me is this kind of thing of formal invention. So that's not there. But I think in terms of style, okay, so what is style? Well, we can think it means, sentence with a spin and a dazzle or whatever. But more importantly, as speaking of stylists, as Martin Amis says, style is intrinsic to perception. So this is a book about the formation of that perception, and I think in a way Amis doesn't go far enough with that observation, but yeah, we're certainly agreed that it's more than just the arrangement of it's more than just the prose. What it's really about style is one's entire consciousness. So, and there we're certainly getting this book. This book is really about how my consciousness came to be formed.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I definitely see that, and I think it's kind of like, I think the term you used for it at one point was like Geoff Dyer karaoke, and it seemed to me like you were kind of batting that aside for this one a little bit,
yeah, and
is that something that stalks you, that tendency to kind of...
Well, in that book about endings, when I was talking about the way that, one of the ways that writers can keep going, having a long career, is being oblivious to the way that being oblivious to what is so obvious to their readers, namely the decline in quality. I was certainly aware that when I was describing other people's symptoms, I was always thinking, oh my God, I'm actually not looking through a window, but looking into a mirror. And so I'm very aware of the potential for self-karaoke at anyone, at this sort of point in a writing life. But, I see that this is the sort of style of this. It's kind of, it's crucial. What's the real thing that's happened to me as a writer over time that is indisputable? Well, in my opinion, I really think I've just got funnier and funnier as a writer. So and this is screamingly funny, I think. I think there's some pretty, there's some gold in there for sure. I guess the kind of like the big question that hangs over the whole thing for me anyway is like a question of like class, and where it leaves you, the 11 plus, and your whole trajectory, from there on in. And I think coming from a kind of like a non-literary household myself, I think, and I've read somewhere that you felt kind of more in common with your wife's kind of family than your own at points in time. Not really, not quite, but certainly there's a sort of there's certain aspects where
like you can kind of parlay in that way over certain subjects that are kind of almost religiously dear to your heart at that point, I guess. If you carve a whole life for yourself in the world through literature and art, being able to kind of touch base on those subjects can feel crucial. But I just wonder, like, in those, in those situations, like for instance, when I'm with my partners, like parents, you know, and they're both in like publishing, and they're kind of like, you know, we can talk about the latest Geoff Dyer, you know.
That must be so
and
great.
we can really go to town on it, you know what I mean? The great decline. But there's always a sort of like, there's always a little bit of, you know, are my aspirations really defections? You know what I mean? Am I in some small way like a traitor to my class? Is that like a kind of, is that a pointless sentiment? Like, is it, are you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't? You know, like you're either dumbing yourself down or climbing to a certain extent and trying to kind of, do you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, yeah. So the book. I mean, so what's the? I was having this conversation with the American editors who are less keen on it than the British, and it's a book about class, really. And I say that because really, you know, let's suppose if you're someone famous, you know, if you're, I mean, you know, Simone Biles, if she has written an autobiography, of course, there's a huge market for it. If she hasn't, people want her to because people are interested in her early life. Now, there's nothing, people aren't interested in my early life, and in a way, there's nothing interesting about it. It's not, you know, there's no buried trauma. It's pretty uneventful.
Yeah, but I mean, so much of the stuff in all of your books is non-events. It's when you're writing about non-events that it's actually at its best, I find, almost.
You know, I don't like sort of event-packed books, but it's not a book of, you know, of revelations really. But the key thing is, so what is the interest in it? Well, you could say, okay, it's got some stylistic signature, but the real thing is that my story is it's not you know, what's interesting about it is in a way what's not unique to me, even though in order to tell it, of course, I have to be very faithful to the peculiarities of my own story. But really, I think if it is interesting, that's because of the larger story it tells about about England at a particular...
Well, like the quote on the back, the class as a happening.
Yeah. Oh, my God, yeah. So that...
I mean,
yeah.
Isn't that kind of a cop-out?
Go on.
Well, I mean, like, it's a happening. It's kind of like, oh, well, you know, I just kind of like wound up here, you know, like up here. I mean, isn't it kind of like the meritocracy of like the 11 plus? Doesn't it just perpetuate the same...
Well,
you know, it's a kind of sham of social mobility eventually, and especially the way things have turned out with, you know, here we are now with this kind of ever-expanding like dearth between the top and the bottom, you know.
Yeah. Well, several things. Just to clarify for people who haven't read it, the quote that Lias is referring to is it ends with this a bit from E.P. Thompson's essay, The Peculiarities of the English, when he, you know, it explains what class is, and he ends up by saying, you know, class is it's a happening, and then he reprints that actually as an epilogue to his, you know, masterpiece, the making of the English working class. But the thing is that I wanted to draw attention to that is the sort of the empirical kind of the faithfulness to lived experience that you get, of course, in Thompson's work. And in a way, I mean, what I wanted to do is to emphasize that this happening which occurred, which was a combination of both something that happened to me and that did contain a certain amount of agency, how they come together, and it's something that's happening not just to me, but it's also happening to, you know, to a number of other places. In that the England, you know, England in the 1960s was famously changing. I mean, it began changing, of course, after the Second World War. But I mean, to go to sort of quibble with some aspects of what you were saying, I mean, I'm not under the delusion at all that the purpose of the 11 plus was to usher in an era of social mobility. It was, in a way, there was an element of that, but the real purpose of it, as we all know, was wasn't to get a few people into the grammar school. It was to ensure that a lot of people didn't, you know, that there was a constant supply of
the wheat
sausage.
From the chaff.
Yeah, to ensure people would fail the 11 plus, and therefore there'd be a supply of people to work in, factories, trades, apprenticeships, all this sort of stuff. And in a way, the sort of people who benefit from that, who pass the exam, and now it's the efficacy, the reliability of that exam is of course questioned. It's not like it was. It was a self-justifying thing as well, because if you passed for the grammar school, if you were lucky enough to pass that exam, then of course you appeared cleverer because you were going on to this in the school I went to. This, I just had this. It was a famously good grammar school with fantastic teachers and all of this sort of stuff. Yeah. So it seemed to be. It seemed that the right people did go to grammar school because look how well they did. But that's a self-determining outcome. Yeah,
because it's like later on in the book you talk about. There's a lovely passage about when you start reading Shakespeare, and it feels like a kind of like there's a sleeper cell that's been there, that's been activated, and that there was this kind of natural longing for a language and expression beyond the day-to-day, and it moves on to that thing about the LP with Shakespeare. And I think you're, about 16 at this time? 15, 16? So considerably later on, to sitting this exam, So it's just kind of unfortunate that maybe these awakenings and these revelations haven't occurred to a child that's so much younger.
Well, right, and it's... there's several things going on there, because there's the other crucial thing in all of this is that I didn't have any brothers or sisters. So so I passed the 11 plus, which was really so important, but I can't really take any credit for that. I could as easily have not passed it. And then when I went under the influence of one particular great teacher at a school full of fantastic teachers, I got into reading.
Bob Beale.
Yeah, and. Then reading, it's sort of there's a bit of a sort of vacuum in your life if you're an only child. I mean, I don't want to overdo the loneliness thing, but certainly I was aware when I was a kid, and there's lots of scenes in the book describing this, that we'd be all out playing, recreating the Second World War behind our house. Then we'd all go in, and my friends would all go into a sort of riotous bath time, and more chaos.
I got two brothers, and it was pure chaos. And my little brother, I used to share a bath with him, and he used to shit in the bath. Like my mum used to have to scoop it out. I'd have to be like, "Mum, he's done it again." So I don't know if it was, maybe you had it better with start playing Jenga on your own or whatever.
There was something going on anyway. For me, it was all just quiet. And so when people have said about the book, the American editor particularly was saying, "God, there's just too much about you and all your toys and all your collecting when you were young." Well, I said, if you're an only child, and my editor at Canongate is sort of an only child, although it turns out he's not entirely an only.
He's a bit of an only child.
There were some brothers from a previous around with his dad, it turns out. So he doesn't have the full existential oneliness. Anyway, so the point being that reading took the place of those sort of that intense time I had alone with my toys. And so there's just sort of reading as a kind of solitary activity, not as a refuge from anything, but just as just something that there was room in my life for it. And then you start reading, and once you've got that sort of bit of receptivity, then at school you start doing Shakespeare, and my God, I mean, if you're at all receptive to language, there you're really to quote Danny, what's his name from Match of the Day, you're really at it then, aren't you? And then Lias mentioned this, there's this lovely thing happened that, so my mum worked in my junior school canteen as a dinner lady, that archetypal sort of English sort of occupation. And then one of the cooks at the canteen, she was one of these sort of working class ladies who liked culture, and she heard I was doing Richard III for O-level, so she lent me this record. And I really did, and it was an edited version of Richard III. It was really great. I've never been able to discover which of those Hammer horror actors played Richard III, whether it was Christopher Lee or, who's the other one? Yeah, exactly. It's one of those two. Anyway, by listening to this, I really did know it off. I could easily do now. I could do the whole opening soliloquy of Richard III, which I won't do now, even though I'm sorely tempted to.
I like you describe it as a kind of de-instrumentalized piece of prog.
Yeah,
eventually.
Yeah, and it's and it was just all this stuff was just kind of it was just some. What that meant was some other current was starting to pass through my body. It was just through my consciousness. And how was that? Well, it was just wonderful, And then it goes on a little bit, So then I start reading more novels. And if you'd met me back then, let's say when I was 16, I was, my social skills were almost zero. But by the time I was 17, when they were still maybe zero, although you couldn't see it because I couldn't express it as well, by then I already had a better understanding of loads of things, psychology, gesture, I even had a better understanding of those things, those people that I couldn't ever bring myself to speak to, girls, because, I was really understanding a lot because by then I'd actually read Middlemarch, so my understanding of the world was so in excess of my circumstances, and that again, that's a very common experience. You can see it in that autobiographical novel of Camus. There's just tons of versions of it. Those Tony Harrison poems in The School of Eloquence, but so it was and that particular sort of development of what's going on in my head, it's that came with a kind of that part of that was incommunicable to my parents.
Yeah, that's another thing you mentioned, where it's kind of like not loneliness but aloneness, that kind of you end up kind of it increases with your love of reading, and it separates you further from your parents,
Yeah, and again, it's not something that, it's so well documented, and, I quote that amazing Tony Harrison poem that he writes after his mum dies, and he talks about the way that, his mum used to say about him and his dad, who was a baker, she'd say, "Oh, you're like bookends, the pair of you. You just sit there, not speaking." And there they are, the mum's died, it's just him and his dad. And he says, even now in this thing that really unites them, he says, as they sit there quietly, he says, despite our sullen looks, nothing can disguise the fact that what's still between us after all these years is books, books, books. And he says it, that final books, he says it with such kind of intensity, which has an element of kind of loathing in it as well. It's an amazingly intense poem, yeah.
Yeah. I was reading another part. You're talking about Shakespeare. There's a kind of Shakespeare rendition of some sort on the telly. I think it's two travelers trying to make their way to Shakespeare or something.
Yeah, I'm looking there up. Do you remember this? It's got Brian Glover in it. There's these three miners. It's a play for today, that great series, and I've been looking out to see if it's going to be part of that revival. So there's these three miners who love Shakespeare, and they take a canal, a barge trip on a canal down from Leeds or wherever it is to Stratford to see a performance. I think it's of Antony and Cleopatra. And it's really fun. They have all these sort of class-based sort of episodes on the way, and it means that they can't get. There are no tickets for the for the performance, and it's all.
Yeah.
And there's some quite funny bits where Brian Glover, an ex-professional wrestler, by the way, he sort of complains. He said, "Look at this. There's all these Japanese and Germans coming here. We're good English blokes, and we can't get in." Anyway, and then and then they happen. It's a lovely bit. They happen to run into, I can't remember the actors' names now, somewhere, and they do this little private recital of a scene from Anthony Cleo for them. Yeah.
But you mentioned like there's a tendency to kind of like self-improvement in the culture back then. Like these things would be spliced with stuff like that, stuff like Ken Burns or something like that.
Yeah.
Not Ken Burns, Kenneth Clark. You know, like getting ahead of myself there.
Wow,
you know, that kind of like almost quite serious kind of intellectual stuff spliced with like outright tar. You know, and that there was this thread of self-improvement in the 60s. And is that something that you feel or have noticed is kind of like has that vanished now? Are we on a permanent road to kind of self-enfeeblement through distraction?
Well, it was more pronounced then, and there was a more, I think of that quote of Gramsci's where he says that, the battle for culture has to be the battle for the high ground. Well, that's been quite seriously undermined. I mean, the idea of what constituted the kind of the heights of human achievement were not really up for discussion then. And there was so a couple of things. One of the striking things about where I grew up, of course, it's the place of the two famous public schools, the boys' college and the girls' college. Beautiful buildings. One of them is one of the buildings is sort of modelled on, I think it's Christ's Cambridge or something. It's really gorgeous, huge grounds. And it's not like we were kind of proto-Bolsheviks as kids thinking, one day we'll burn that place down. We just had zero contact with that place at all. I never met anyone from the boys' college until, weirdly, the very first night I spent at Oxford when I went for an interview and met somebody interviewing at Christchurch who was been at the boys' college. Anyway, the only sign of life we ever... here we'll do this as a quiz question. Guess what the only sign of life was that I had of the boys' college? This is a cultural question. Oh, okay. What? Oh, right, there's that. I mean, it wasn't that, as it happens. But when I was at junior school, this would be I guess I was about 10, we loved collecting badges, and these badges went round, square badges, which just sort of said, if, principal, if, whatever. So, don't know what they were, blah, blah, blah. It was just we collected them. And then, one day I'm starting to watch sort of more serious films on TV, and this film comes on TV called If. And, I recognize it instantly. My God, it's set in the Cheltenham Boys' College with Malcolm McDowell. And, it was kind of remarkable. I saw loads of the street scenes in it. And as you'll remember, there's this bit where quite often in the film, they play this music that Malcolm McDowell listens to over and over in his little study, a sort of chanting or a sort of choir-like thing, but not like Matthew's Passion or something. I really loved it. So I just wrote to the BBC. I think I just wrote to the BBC, and with saying, what was that music in that? And within a week, I didn't even enclose a stamped addressed envelope. And within a week, somebody wrote back saying it's called the Misa Luba by the whatever singers. And, then a week later, I was able to buy it in Boots. And, I feel that was illustrative.
Do you think that kind of like that there's a kind of ritual there, an engagement with your passion for that piece of music? You got to go and write a letter to the BBC, you wait for it, then you got to order it from Woolworths. So there's, it becomes an almost sacred, like the Shakespeare LP, like your relationship with these artifacts in this period in time.
Oh, well, yeah.
What have we lost in convenience?
Well, yeah, and then, of course, meanwhile, I was no stranger to record shops because, I was in them buying all the prog stuff. And, but the point I want to make is just how, that to me incarnated the Reithian project of what the purpose of the BBC and broadcasting was, and they, it was just it was just wonderful in retrospect, but it wasn't exceptional because, of course, closer to home, I had this kind of thing which Americans find extraordinary, just endless free healthcare for a sickly child like me. The whole education I got, everything was free, free school, Oxford was free, and I felt so rich when I became a student. I got a full grant. First thing I did was buy a stereo. It was it feels that this was this is when and it was in a way we'd think, no, where does that kind of thing go on now? Well, we think of the great social democracies, of Scandinavia, this kind of thing. So this kind of thing of the taxes paying for the taxpayers' money going to build this kind of thing was money well spent, I think. Now, of course, I'm not forgetting that. I was. I'd acquire, this was all part of that grammar school life. My friends who'd gone to Norton Park Secondary Modern weren't writing in to ask about the Misa frigging Luba.
Well, they might have done, but today you would just have it instantly. And therefore you'd be, there's that thing, and then you move on to the next shiny thing, and the next shiny thing, and there's a kind of like everything is kind of liquefied,
Well, exactly. But fortunately, I mean, the other aspect of that is, there's lots of really fun stuff. I mean, so it was the 1960s when... it's a lot, consumer culture is really starting to get going. And there's lots of fun bits in the book about my dad's unbelievable tight-fistedness. And he was so at odds with buying anything. But we got a record player, and, that was fine. He didn't, it was quite okay. He didn't want to listen to music. But then he realized that, okay, he bought the record player. Every week there's new records coming out on top of the pops. This is a limitless, bottomless source of expenditure. And pretty soon, I mean, music wasn't banned like it was under the Taliban, but it was sort of underfunded to the extent that it just kind of withered away for many years. And then, I mean, his resistance to all sort of waste was so intense. And there's a bit where I say, okay, it was I contrast it with this thing now where, of course, you're as a kid, I don't have kids, but I'm told that kids feel really like they lack status if they've got an iPhone if they've got an iPhone that's a bit out of date, or they don't have the latest trainers, all that kind of stuff. And I feel in a way how lucky I was to be part of that era where none of that applied. And also my parents, God, to call it thriftiness doesn't do justice to it. I mean,
Well, there was a thing written in the, I think it was in an otherwise glowing review in the Financial Times about this book recently. And I think it was describing your carrying the torch of your father's tight-fistedness, despite obvious professional success. And they described it, and I really love this expression, as a kind of spiritual bad breath.
Oh, God.
And it was I think it was a 5-star review, you know what I mean? So that's what do you make of a statement like that?
Well, I mean, I obviously I hadn't got to that bit, or I'd sort of, well, there's another, in another way, it's a sign of rude health, because, if I found myself on New Bond Street or something like that, and it was, it's one of those streets, it's got all those shops like Gucci and, I don't know, Dolce and Gabbana or something like that. And as I was looking at these shops, I was just feeling such contempt for these places and the people in them. And I thought, God, and I felt it so strongly, I realized, you go past these places of heightened expense.
I think they were more referring to like the shampoo bottles in Federer. I don't think we've all got a disdain for Bond Street. That's you know what I mean? They're talking about the more pathological kind of
Right, well,
aspect.
that's everyone loves stealing shampoo from hotels, except I really have taken it to a higher level.
To a professional kind of.
But what I was going to say is places like that are, you look at those shops and they are places of cheapened value. And,
Of course.
and I think in a way, there's all sorts of ways now that, my parents' attitude to all this sort of stuff, it's actually now quite fashionable. It's a form of sort of sustainable living. And, I really have very fond memories of that thing that went on when we were a kid of saving the milk bottle tops to so it could.
I hate it. My dad would make me and my two brothers would all have to share the same can of Coke,
Well, don't you?
And he could afford 3 cans of Coke.
Yeah, but don't you feel in a way you have a can of Coke now, and the first half is great, and the second half,
it's true, but when you
it's a bit of a struggle to get
it
through
is a
that.
bit of a struggle.
I always, I'm an only child, so my impulse is to open it, glug it down, and then I realize, I'm not liking this anymore. And at that point, I turn to Rebecca and say, would you like some?
And there we have the bad breath.
Lias.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, 1 or 2 more questions. I was going to say when I was plugging this event online, somebody I don't remember who it was, some stranger through the through social media, and they said, Geoff Dyer, he's one of those writers that's maybe dearest to people that are kind of interested in becoming writers.
Oh.
And I thought that was like kind of rang true on some level. And I was wondering how maybe you felt about your status as a kind of like a gateway drug kind of author.
Yeah. I wonder if that also is part of that compliment or that comment, the fact that I'm a writer that people grow out of. And that's...
I don't know, more like a kind of foundational.
Right, or a sort of conduit to something. But, how do I feel about it? Geez, I'm just so grateful that anybody, just any kind of kind word goes an awful long way. I mean, it's, I don't know. I don't know.
But would you rather like Blockbuster name and lights kind of like classic kind of...
I always refer to all of my books as blockbusters. Yeah. That's an appropriate way to.
Was it true Cillian Murphy wanted to buy the rights for Death?
Apparently, yeah. And then when I did this thing with him once, he said that I'd said no, and that's not true because if the idea of him doing it, I'd have been that appeal. I'd have like a rat up a drain pipe.
Still quite a sexy look though, turning down Cillian.
Well, I didn't. I just wasn't for some reason. It just didn't wind its way to me. This offer, and anyway,
I'd stick to his version of events.
But yeah, I don't know what the books mean to. I mean, what I do feel though is that. And what's this book about? I mean, I did say to the publishers at one point, because I have such strong feelings about what's right, and I always feel I know better than the publishers, and to the American publishers, maybe even to the British ones as well, I said, what about subtitling it not a memoir, but a prelude? Because I liked the idea of that Wordsworthian kind of echo in that, and they felt that was a bad idea, and I wasn't always convinced that it was a good idea, but that's what it is. It's a prelude about somebody becoming the very early stage of becoming a writer. Because how do you become a writer? As I'm always telling my students at USC, well, you have to become a reader first of all.
Yeah, and there was one thing I wanted to ask you about reading specifically on a kind of technique level, like rereading your own work. When you're kind of trying to get like from one passage to another, and you reread something incessantly in order to get the flow into the next passage. Do you sometimes get bogged down where it becomes like you can't change this thing? It becomes sacrosanct once you've learned it by rote.
No. I'm always happy. I mean, I change things quite late in the day. I mean, God, Canongate, they're so tolerant. I was still making changes to the proof number 8. Yeah. It was funny. It became a kind of interesting thing of just wondering how long can we keep this going for? Proof 220. Still changing the odd comma, that kind of stuff. But it's certain. I mean, so I did delete various passages quite late in the day, and
Okay. Well, I think we'll open it up to the field. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Dyer? I think they're going to come up with the...
Yeah, just a question about your sort of political awakening, if you had one as a young person and, in the 60s or 70s, very kind of prominent politics, the kind of Labour, the unions and all that, and how that kind of impacted on you and where your sort of political awakening came from, if you had one.
Yeah, well, my dad was, of course, a sort of staunch Labour voter. That was just in our sort of making. And he was also, he was really anti the royals. He really thought they were, it's funny, my sort of political take on that has not really advanced before. I feel the royals, what are they? They're just a bunch of welfare dependents, and Prince Harry, even though he still wants us to fund his, anyway. So there's that. He was also very, very anti-religion. So there's that kind of stuff. And so I sort of just, that was what I sort of absorbed. But really, in terms of a political awakening, it's really a source of astonishment to me that I just had no understanding really of the process I'd been through until incredibly belatedly. So I get to Oxford, and I'm aware that I'm meeting people from very different backgrounds to me, but I didn't have any larger understanding of that. I still thought this was some sort of experience that was unique to me. And and it really wasn't till after I left Oxford that I had any kind of political awakening, and I can locate it pretty precisely. I only understood that there was a larger process, that I was part of a larger process, and that all of this sort of stuff, it wasn't about accents or anything like that. It was really about class. And honestly, that began with, when I read Raymond Williams, and then, pretty much soon after that, then I'm reading E.P. Thompson and all this other stuff. And that's when it happened. So I got this a belated understanding that this was a class thing that I'd experienced, and it's still a source of astonishment to me that I only came to that understanding retrospectively. Maybe I got some kind. We did look back in anger for A level, and that sort of that play with Jimmy Porter's Rage. I think that was that sort of I sort of identified with that, and of course it's quite interesting. Osborne as an archetype of that angry young man. So many people like that have built into their trajectory that turn to the right that they all took. So anyway, that's what happened. Yeah, and then I became sort of over class conscious, I think, in a way.
How do you mean?
Maybe I was, I think I possibly put too much emphasis on it, really, and but it's that's. I went through a phase where I sort of converted to this. I went through a let's put it like this. I went through a deeply ideological phase. It was
until about what age?
That would be in my mid-20s. And so it was funny to go back to my parents, and there I was, like, hegemony, ideological state apparatuses. It was ridiculous.
Classic.
Although I always, when my friends who were in the SWP selling Socialist Worker outside Brixton Tube, I never for a moment considered wearing a donkey jacket. I want to make that clear. That always seemed like pure affectation.
Anybody else? Yeah?
When did you last watch Where Eagles Dare?
And
does it come up in the book?
Say again?
Does it come up in the book as well? I haven't read it.
I haven't really watched it since I finished that little book about it, because I'd really watched it to death, at that point. But if I were to see it again, there's no question at all that my enjoyment of it would be undiminished, in a way that is not the case with other films from my childhood, such as The Italian Job. You know, that would be a really stupid way to spend my time watching that again, you know.
You said that this book might be considered a prelude. Yeah. Does that mean it might have a successor about the rest of your life?
I can answer that with absolute conviction. It is emphatically not volume 1 of a 6-volume Nausgardian sequence. It's only the prelude in the Wordsworthian sense that. No, it was absolutely. I mean, so the book, it stops. There's a spoiler here. So it stops at the age of 18 with my greatest achievements. You know, my 3 grade A's at A level, and then getting a place at Oxford. It's really been all downhill since then. So I like the idea that it ends on this moment of unalloyed, unqualified triumph. Yeah, and then it's funny, and I always knew that's where it was going to end. And it's a slightly strange thing in a way that when I'm reading biographies of people, the childhood bits always bore the pants off me. Slightly different with autobiographies, because then you're at the writer's ability plays such a big part. But the only thing I hate more than the bits of childhood in a biography is that when they go on about, when you go into the genealogy, what the grandparents did, I cannot bear that stuff.
Anybody else? He's really selling it. Hey.
Thank you very much for the backstory of your younger brother.
There was a time just waiting to cast that pearl.
Yeah, I'll have to have a word with him. And also, Geoff, I was just wondering, you wrote a book about Brixton. Could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between, let's say, Brixton, the Socialist Worker Party, and if there's any relationship to Los Angeles?
Wow, I don't think there is at all. No. I mean, I'm desperately trying to come up with an answer that's more than no. I mean, what's the reasoning behind the question?
Well, I was in Brixton in the 80s.
Oh, could we need a mic, because I can hear you, but other people probably can't.
I was in Brixton in the 80s, and there were a lot of donkey jacket wearing SWP at the Tube. Yeah. And I just wondered if that had played a part. And earlier you were talking about Los Angeles and also your relationship with further up the coast, San Francisco. Yeah. And you spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, and the relationship between a kind of grimy part of South London, Brixton, and sort of comparing that with Los Angeles kind of is so interesting. Yeah, really. I just wondered if you could talk about it.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing about Brixton, that's really when I came into my own.
Whereabouts in Brixton? Sorry.
Always very close to the George Canning, always close to Brixton Water Lane. So St Matthew's Road, 51 Brixton Water Lane, and then 4 Crownstone Court. Where
have you been back there recently?
No, it's too far away from where I am now.
West London.
Yeah. And but
it's a trek.
I think the key thing here actually is, so that's really when that was such an incredible period for me, when I was reading all these people like Raymond Williams and Berger and all this sort of stuff. So it's the life recorded in the colour of memory. By the time I get to Los Angeles, I'm 56 or something. So, I'm pretty thoroughly formed at that point. And quite often I would say to my wife, if it's in a way I feel I'm too old for the life that Los Angeles promises in a way. And also, my mind was made up by then about how I wanted cities to be, so that to take a a really obvious example, I sort of refused to adapt to the car culture in a slightly idiotic, self-mortifying way.
So what did you just stay at home for 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, really, with every year, as we came to dread driving more and more, our lives geographically shrank.
To just your house.
Yeah, I mean, really, yeah.
Was it a nice house?
Well, of course, we were also during the pandemic, we were obliged to stay in the house. But so being in Los Angeles, there was that. But also, we did take trips because, of course, we had access to something which I think is also my attraction to it as a direct product of growing up here, where, in England. My love of the landscapes, the expansive landscapes of the American Southwest, the appeal of that never diminished. Although at the weekends we'd go out to all these deserts or whatever, and then it was always the same story. We'd going out and it was so wonderful when we're in Death Valley or something. And I'd say to Rebecca, "We've got to do this all the time." And then slogging back in traffic on a Sunday with all the other people who'd had the same thought, we'd say, "Oh, God, we're never going to do this again."
Anybody else? We'll get to you next. I think we've got somebody at the back, yeah?
Yeah, hello. I was just wondering what you make of the resurgence of interest in D.H. Lawrence over the last few years, and nodality. Does London have a nodality for you?
I guess it does, but not. So that's the word nodality crops up in one of these essays of genius by Lawrence about Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, and the Lawrence revival. I mean, maybe I've played a small part in this ongoing attempted revival. I kept on at one of the editors at Penguin saying, "Come on, let me edit a selection of Lawrence's essays." And I kept pestering him, and eventually we did bring out this one-volume edition of Lawrence essays, and he said he was skeptical because he's made so many attempts to rehabilitate Lawrence from the kicking he got from Kate Millett in the 70s, and it's still difficult to it's still not re-established. Certainly will never again have the status that he had, when Philip Larkin can say that, he believed that Lawrence was the greatest writer of the 20th century. I mean, that ain't going to happen. But I think really what is happening is that there's an awareness of Lawrence beyond the canonical Lawrence that I was offered, that I was fed as a student. So I feel people are more conscious now perhaps than they were of the vital bit, what remains vital in Lawrence, which is very different to what was once considered his central achievement.
Hi. So much of your writing is about travelogues or about your... I just wonder whether you get to in the book where your wanderlust comes from, and you mentioned, secondly, you mentioned Los Angeles or California as a place in your dreams. Are there any places in your dreams you've not yet been to?
Well, there'd be a few, but I know precisely where my desire to travel came from. It was a real conscious thing of self-overcoming in a way, because we never went on holiday anywhere nice as a family. We'd go to Weston-super-Mare or Bournemouth, and as you know, you go to these places, you go to the seaside, it ends up raining, and then we'd have to go to the cinema, because it's raining, and this became for my dad, it was just an awful thing because, geez, I mean, it's just all it involved was expenditure. So we were happier all round staying in, even though my friends at that point, I mean, I remember so well my friend Keith Williams coming back from his summer holiday. I was so envious. He came back from the Isle of Wight and he was just red raw with sunburn. And I thought, oh my God, that's what we want, you know. And it seemed so fantastic. And, you know, so my parents really didn't ever they couldn't see the point of going on holiday. And then, I mean, it's quite interesting in a way. He did go abroad once to India, sent there during the war. Quite common, I think, for somebody of his generation. And he was interested in India thereafter. Then he came back home, and until my mum forced him to go on this unbelievably dismal coach tour of northern France when they were in their 70s, he never left. Maybe once he accidentally strayed into Wales. He really hated the Welsh. He also hated the Scots and the Irish as well, and was deeply suspicious of many parts of England. So they both died without ever having flown on a plane, for example. Anyway, so it wasn't in my blood to travel. And then a couple of things happened. Well, Lawrence, of course, you know, who I loved so much, travelled. And then after I'd passed for Oxford, one of my English teachers said, well, what are you going to do with your year off? And I said, well, I've got an office job in Cheltenham. And he said, well, you've got to go somewhere. So with two friends, we went on this kind of driving holiday around Europe. Didn't really like that. And for many years after that, as I started to go on little sort of holidays, I never really liked it. And then gradually I realized that what I did like was spending longer periods abroad, because then I could have my little routine as a writer, you know, and still be somewhere new. And then gradually I started to really like it. Yeah. So, and this is, you know, this book is a kind of travelogue in a way, but it's just of a quite geographically restricted form of travel. That's why I have the maps as end papers to help the reader navigate this very highly localized terrain.
Anyone else? I think we've reached the end. Have we reached the end? Speak now. Okay. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I was. It was when we were saying in the green room beforehand, we were saying how long this would be, and I said, my God, this is, I mean, the time you've allotted for this is absolutely at the limits of human endurance. So I think I've been proved right, and thank you for enduring. Yeah, and thank you, Lias.
Thank you very much.